The small town of Pine Hollow, tucked away in the heart of rural Tennessee, was the kind of place where secrets festered beneath the surface. The population barely broke 1,000, with most residents working the same jobs their parents had: logging, farming, or running small businesses. But beneath the serene, tight-knit exterior of the town lay deep tensions, none more tragic than the troubled home of the Thompsons. Shay Thompson had always been a solitary figure. He owned a small plot of land on the outskirts of town, surrounded by dense pine trees that seemed to form a natural barrier between him and the world. A logger by trade, he was known for his brute strength, silent demeanor, and short temper. After his wife, Marla, had passed suddenly from a heart attack 3 years earlier, Ed was left to raise their only daughter, 16-year-old Lily. Lily was everything her father wasn't. Bright, cheerful, and full of hope, she was beloved by her peers. Her laughter could often be heard drifting through the town's quiet streets, a stark contrast to the grim expression her father wore. Yet, despite her sunny exterior, there were whispers among neighbors of shouting matches from the Thompson house, of Lily coming to school with bruises and quickly trying to cover them with long sleeves or scarves. The townspeople turned a blind eye. Pine Hollow had a way of ignoring what was uncomfortable, preferring to believe in its idyllic charm rather than face the rot that had begun to set in. But no amount of ignorance could prepare them for what would be uncovered one foggy October morning. It was a night like any other in Pine Hollow. The wind howled softly through the towering pines, and the crickets chirped in a familiar, rhythmic chorus. Ed had come home late from work, his clothes covered in sawdust, his hands calloused from years of hard labor. As usual, the house was quiet when he entered. Lily had been in her room, the soft glow of her bedside lamp visible through the gap in her door. But something had changed. There was a tension in the air that even Ed could not ignore. For weeks, Lily had grown distant, barely speaking to him, her face clouded with sadness and frustration. Ed blamed her teenage rebellion, but deep down, a festering anger was growing. The walls of the small house seemed to close in on him every night, Marla's absence lingering like a ghost, and Lily's defiance only added to his sense of isolation. As the clock ticked past midnight, Ed made his way to Lily's room. The argument started quietly, like so many others before, but soon escalated. It wasn't long before Ed's patience snapped, and something darker took over. In a blind rage, he grabbed the heavy hammer from his tool belt that he had left on the kitchen counter. Lily's pleas fell on deaf ears as his mind clouded with fury. The strike was quick and brutal, and the soft glow of her room was extinguished as quickly as her life. Lily's body slumped lifelessly onto the floor, blood pooling around her head, her eyes wide in shock. For the silence that followed was deafening, broken only by Ed's ragged breaths. For a long time, Ed stood over her motionless form, the weight of what he had done sinking in like an anchor pulling him under. But there was no panic, no sudden wave of regret. Instead, there was a cold, hollow acceptance. He had done it, and now there was no going back. The night pressed on, but Ed Thompson's mind remained eerily calm. He stared down at Lily's body, her once vibrant presence now reduced to a still, lifeless shell on the floor. A crimson pool slowly spread beneath her head, darkening the wood planks of her bedroom floor. The air felt thick, almost choking, but Ed remained steady. There was no room for panic. If anyone found out, his life would be over. Prison, judgment, the shame. He couldn't let that happen. With methodical precision, Ed retrieved a plastic tarp from the shed outside. The cold night air barely registered against his skin as he moved in and out of the house, almost robotic in his actions. Pine Hollow was asleep, its residents unaware of the dark deed unfolding within their peaceful town. The only sound was the occasional rustling of leaves as a breeze drifted through the pines. Inside, he wrapped Lily's body in the tarp, careful not to let the blood seep onto the floor any further. He knew the mess he had to clean up. The hammer, stained with blood and bits of hair, was tossed into a bucket filled with bleach. His hands, shaking slightly, scrubbed away at the floorboards where the blood had soaked through. It wasn't perfect, but it would do for now. Ed knew no one ever came out this way. No one would come knocking unexpectedly. Dragging the wrapped body out the back door, Ed struggled under the weight of his daughter. She had grown taller in the past year, almost as tall as her mother had been. Her weight was solid, reminding Ed of the reality of what he had done. But he kept moving, driven by the need to erase what had happened. Out in the woods behind their property was a shallow creek that ran along the edge of town. But years ago, when Lily was younger, they would sometimes go fishing there. Now it was a forgotten place, the water having dried up to a slow trickle. It was the perfect spot, remote and forgotten, just like he needed. The cover of night as his shield, Ed dug through the hardened soil beside the creek. Each shovel thrust was exhausting, but the adrenaline that had taken over his body kept him going. When the hole was deep enough, he lowered Lily's body into it. For a moment, he stood over the grave, the reality of the situation pressing against him. This was his daughter, his own flesh and blood. But the thought passed as quickly as it came, buried as deep as the body beneath him, where he covered the grave, patting the dirt down with his boots until it blended into the rest of the forest floor. When the task was done, Ed stood in the silence of the woods, staring at the spot where Lily now lay hidden beneath the earth. There was no sound except for the distant rustle of the wind through the trees. He had done what needed to be done, he told himself. No one would know. The next morning, the town of Pine Hollow awoke to a new day, unaware of the horror that had taken place just hours earlier. The air was crisp with the early onset of fall, and the streets were quiet, save for the occasional hum of a passing truck or the bark of a dog. Life went on as usual. But Ed Thompson had not slept. He sat in his kitchen, staring at the untouched cup of coffee before him. The weight of the previous night clung to him like a second skin. He knew the questions would come. Lily wasn't the kind of girl who disappeared without someone noticing. Her absence from school would be the first red flag. The town would start asking questions, people would start coming around. And they did. By mid-afternoon, a knock came at the door. Ed opened it to find Mrs. Harper, a local teacher from the high school, standing on his porch. She had come to ask about Lily, her face filled with concern. Lily hadn't shown up to class, and that wasn't like her. Maybe she was sick, Mrs. Harper suggested, though her tone was more probing than sympathetic. Ed remained calm, telling her that Lily had gone out early in the morning to visit a friend on the other side of town. He reassured her with a forced smile that everything was fine. Mrs. Harper hesitated for a moment, her eyes studying his face, but eventually nodded and left. Ed watched her walk down the gravel path, his heart pounding in his chest. He had bought himself time, but he knew it wouldn't last long. In a town as small as Pine Hollow, word spread fast. People would start to talk, and soon enough, Lily's absence would become more than just a passing concern. The first real sign of trouble came when the sheriff himself arrived later that evening. Sheriff Wilkins was a no-nonsense man who had lived in Pine Hollow all his life. He knew everyone in town, and Ed had known him for years. They exchanged the usual pleasantries, but Ed could feel the sheriff's eyes lingering on him for a moment too long. Lily hasn't been around today, Wilkins said, leaning against the porch railing. Some folks are worried. Ed played his part, feigning concern. He repeated the same story about her visiting a friend, suggesting she might have decided to stay over, but Wilkins wasn't buying it. He knew Pine Hollow too well. He knew when something wasn't right. The following days saw the quiet town of Pine Hollow buzz with growing unease. Lily Thompson, one of the brightest young women in the community, had vanished without a trace. Sheriff Wilkins, although used to the occasional teenager runaway or misunderstanding, could sense this was different. Something gnawed at him about Ed's demeanor during their brief conversation. The man had always been cold and distant, but this time there was something off, something that didn't sit right. By the end of the week, Lily had not returned, and the sheriff decided to make things official. A missing persons report was filed, and small search parties were organized to comb the woods and outskirts of the town. Volunteers were everywhere, neighbors, teachers, even some of Lily's classmates walking side by side calling out her name as they ventured deeper into the pine forests that surrounded the town, the very woods where Ed had buried his daughter. But Ed, who once lived his life in the background, now found himself at the center of unwanted attention. People began dropping by the house, asking if there had been any news or if Lily had called. He played the concerned father well enough, but the cracks were starting to show. His nerves frayed with each knock at the door, each well-meaning visit. He found himself locking the door and peering out through the curtains, waiting for the next wave of suspicion. The sheriff, sensing Ed's discomfort, made another visit. This time it wasn't just to check in. Wilkins asked to come inside, citing the routine need to check Lily's room for any clues, a letter, a diary, something that might explain her sudden disappearance. His heart raced as the sheriff walked through the house. The hammer had long been cleaned and put away, and the small bloodstain on the floor had been scrubbed raw. Still, he felt exposed, every creak of the floorboard echoing in his head like an accusation. When Wilkins reached Lily's room, he stood in the doorway for a long time, surveying the space as if expecting something to leap out at him. "This where she usually spent her time?" the sheriff asked, not taking his eyes off the bed. Ed nodded stiffly, keeping his distance. The room had been left untouched since that night. Her school books still lay on the desk, and her favorite sweater was draped over the back of a chair. Everything about the room screamed of a life interrupted. So the sheriff's eyes scanned the walls, the floor, the corners, and finally the window that faced the woods. He was silent for a long time before he turned back to Ed, giving him one last, unreadable look before he finally left. The whole interaction left Ed's nerves frayed. He couldn't shake the feeling that Wilkins had noticed something, perhaps not enough to act on, but enough to stir the waters. That night, Ed couldn't sleep. He sat at the kitchen table, his hands trembling as they clutched a glass of whiskey. The silence in the house felt oppressive, suffocating. Every shadow seemed to mock him, whispering what he had done. The longer Lily's absence stretched on, the more paranoid he became. The search for Lily Thompson intensified. Posters of her face appeared all over town, stapled to telephone poles, pinned to bulletin boards at the diner and the gas station. Her bright smile, once a symbol of innocence, now haunted the community. The townspeople had grown restless. Everyone loved Lily, and the longer she stayed missing, the more people began to whisper. Rumors started to circulate, and Ed could feel them swirling around him. He could hear the murmurs at the grocery store, catch the sideways glances at the gas station. The story he had concocted about Lily visiting a friend no longer held up under scrutiny. Friends and neighbors started asking questions. Why hadn't anyone seen her that morning? Why hadn't the friend she supposedly visited come forward? The pressure was mounting, and Ed could feel the walls closing in. Sheriff Wilkins, sensing that time was running out, ramped up his investigation. He spoke to Lily's classmates, her teachers, and anyone who might know something about her life leading up to her disappearance. The more he dug, the more he found cracks in Ed's story. No one could verify seeing Lily the day she vanished, and there was no evidence of her ever making it to the friend's house. Then came the revelation that some of Lily's closest friends had seen signs of trouble at home: bruises, whispered confessions of fights with her father, her growing fear of him. Sheriff Wilkins began connecting the dots, but he lacked hard evidence. He couldn't just accuse Ed without something concrete. Still, the tension in the town was palpable. People whispered about Ed wherever he went. They noticed how reclusive he had become, how defensive he seemed when asked about Lily. It was only a matter of time before someone would act on those whispers. The pressure finally came to a head one morning when a group of Lily's friends decided to confront Ed at his house. They had grown tired of waiting for answers and hoped that maybe they could catch him in a lie, force him to reveal something he was hiding. They marched up to his front door and knocked. Ed opened the door, his eyes hollow, his face unshaven and gaunt. He looked at the group of teenagers standing before him, their faces filled with anger, grief, and suspicion. The leader of the group, a boy who had been close to Lily since childhood, asked bluntly, "Where is she, Mr. Thompson?" Ed's heart raced. He stammered out the same story he had told everyone else, but it sounded weak, even to his own ears. The group stood there in silence for a moment, staring at him as if they could see straight through his lies. The weight of their gaze was unbearable. Without another word, the group turned and walked away, but Ed knew this was only the beginning. The town no longer believed him. As the days passed, Ed Thompson became a prisoner in his own home. The weight of suspicion from the town was suffocating. Everywhere he went, eyes followed him, whether in the local grocery store, at the post office, or on the streets. The once polite, if distant, interactions with neighbors had turned cold. No one greeted him anymore. People crossed the street to avoid him. Ed's isolation only deepened, the walls of his small house closing in as paranoia gnawed at him. He had stopped going into town altogether, hoping that staying out of sight might ease the pressure. But it didn't. The search for Lily was relentless. Every day, the sheriff's office organized new groups to comb through the woods surrounding Pine Hollow. Ed knew it was only a matter of time before they stumbled upon the shallow grave by the creek. Each morning, he would listen for the faint sounds of footsteps in the woods or the distant echo of voices, fearing that they would come too close to his secret. His nights were worse. The guilt that he had managed to push down in the days after the murder now clung to him like a heavy fog. He couldn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the wind outside his window made him jump. So he saw Lily everywhere, in the empty chair at the kitchen table, in the hallway, her pale face flashing in his mind whenever he closed his eyes. The silence that once comforted him now felt like a constant looming threat. Then came the knock. One evening, just after dusk, the sound of someone rapping at the front door echoed through the house. Ed froze, the glass of whiskey in his hand trembling slightly. He didn't want to answer it. He didn't want to face whoever stood on the other side. But the knocking persisted, and eventually, with shaking hands, Ed opened the door. Sheriff Wilkins stood on the porch, his wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his weathered face. Behind him stood two deputies. They were polite, but their eyes told a different story. "Evening, Ed," the sheriff said, his tone measured and neutral. "We need to ask you some more questions about Lily." Ed's stomach lurched, but he managed to keep his expression neutral. He invited them inside, though the very air in the house seemed to thicken with their presence. Wilkins took his hat off and glanced around the small living room as if he were taking in every detail. The deputies remained by the door, silent but watchful. "We've been expanding the search," Wilkins began, settling into a chair. "Haven't found much yet, but I wanted to check in with you, see if there's anything you've remembered, anything that could help us." Ed sat across from the sheriff, his hands gripping his knees to keep them from shaking. His mind raced, trying to piece together the same old story, but Wilkins wasn't buying it anymore. There was a shift in his tone, an intensity in his gaze that Ed hadn't noticed before. "We've talked to a lot of folks," Ed, Wilkins continued, his voice lowering slightly. "Some of Lily's friends mentioned she wasn't happy here, that she'd been scared of you." Ed's heart thundered in his chest. He opened his mouth to defend himself, to say something, anything, but his throat was dry, and the words wouldn't come. "Look, I know things can get heated at home," Wilkins said, his voice deceptively calm, "but we're talking about a missing girl, your daughter. If there's anything you're holding back, now's the time to come clean." For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the ticking of the clock on the wall. Ed could feel the weight of the sheriff's gaze, the suspicion hanging in the air like a storm about to break. He swallowed hard and shook his head, managing to stammer, I don't know anything, Sheriff. I told you she left that morning, said she was going to see a friend." Wilkins didn't respond right away. He sat there, studying Ed's face, his silence more unsettling than any interrogation could have been. Then, slowly, he stood up, placing his hat back on his head. "All right, Ed," he said, his voice soft but laced with warning, "but we're not giving up on finding Lily. If you think of anything, you give me a call." With that, the sheriff and his deputies left, but the message was clear. They were closing in. Ed could feel it in his bones. Sheriff Wilkins' visit rattled Ed more than he cared to admit. The sheriff knew something. Ed could see it in his eyes. The net was tightening, and Ed's thin veneer of calm was unraveling. He spent the next few days barely leaving the house, pacing restlessly between the living room and the back porch, his mind running in circles. He had covered his tracks, hadn't he? The bloodstains were gone, the body buried deep enough, but the nagging feeling that it wasn't enough gnawed at him. Every noise from outside set him on edge. The snap of a twig, the distant murmur of voices, all of it sounded like footsteps, like someone closing in on his secret. It wasn't long before Ed found himself standing at the edge of the woods one night, staring toward the spot where he had buried Lily. He could see it in his mind, the makeshift grave by the creek, hidden beneath the thick canopy of pines. What if they found it? What if the search parties came through here and uncovered the truth? Desperation began to creep into his thoughts. He considered digging up the body, moving it somewhere deeper, more remote, but the idea of unearthing Lily again sent a chill down his spine. The image of her lifeless face, her blood-stained hair, had haunted his nightmares, and the thought of seeing it again made his skin crawl. But that wasn't the worst of it. As the days passed, Ed became convinced that someone else knew. Every time he went into town, he felt the weight of eyes on him, the silent accusation in every glance. People didn't need to say anything. Their faces told him all he needed to know. They suspected him, and it was only a matter of time before suspicion turned into action. One evening, just before sunset, Ed stood at his kitchen window, staring out into the woods, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, his mind spinning with thoughts of what he had done. I couldn't keep living like this, on the edge of discovery. Something had to give. He couldn't hold on much longer, but just as he was about to turn away from the window, he saw something movement in the trees. The movement in the trees sent a jolt of panic through Ed's body. His heart pounded as he squinted into the dimming light of dusk, and for a moment he thought it might just be an animal, a deer or raccoon, but as he focused, he realized it wasn't. There was a person out there, moving cautiously among the pines. Ed's stomach twisted. It was too close, right near where he had buried Lair. Grabbing his flashlight, Ed rushed out of the house, the screen door slamming shut behind him. He stumbled through the yard, the beam of the flashlight shaking in his unsteady hand. He could feel the sweat forming on his brow, the cold air burning in his lungs as he approached the woods. His mind raced with a single, terrifying thought: someone's found her. As he reached the tree line, he saw the figure more clearly. It was Sheriff Wilkins, his back turned to Ed as he knelt near the creek bed. The beam from Wilkins' own flashlight illuminated the disturbed patch of earth where Lily had been buried. Ed froze, his body trembling with a mix of fear and rage. Wilkins had found it. The sheriff had uncovered the one secret Ed had fought so desperately to keep hidden, but he felt the weight of the world pressing down on him, squeezing the air from his lungs. His head spun as he watched Wilkins slowly dig at the ground, his movements careful and deliberate. Without thinking, Ed rushed forward, his mind consumed by the need to stop Wilkins from discovering what lay beneath the soil. He lunged toward the sheriff, but Wilkins had anticipated this. In one swift movement, the sheriff turned and grabbed Ed by the arm, shoving him backward. "That's enough," Ed Wilkins said, his voice low but firm. The look in his eyes was one of cold certainty. "It's over." Ed stumbled back, panting, his body shaking from the adrenaline coursing through him. He looked down at the grave, the soil now partially exposed. There was no point in denying it any longer. Wilkins had found her, and the truth was about to be laid bare for the entire town to see. "You don't have to do this," Ed stammered, his voice breaking. But Wilkins shook his head. "I knew something wasn't right the moment you opened that door," the sheriff said, his voice filled with quiet resolve. "But I didn't want to believe it was this. Lily deserved better than this, Ed." The last of Ed's defenses crumbled, and with it any semblance of composure he had left. He dropped to his knees in the dirt, his hands covering his face as he finally broke down. For the first time since that terrible night, the weight of what he had done crushed him completely. Wilkins stood over him, silent, as the truth that had been buried for so long came to light. The morning sun broke over Pine Hollow, casting long shadows across the town as news of Ed Thompson's arrest spread like wildfire. It was the talk of every home, every diner, and every street corner. People couldn't believe it, and yet, in some ways, they had known all along. They had sensed something was wrong, had seen the cracks in Ed's story from the beginning. But now there was no more guessing. Lily had been found, and her father was responsible. The sheriff's office was quiet that morning. Ed sat in the small, dimly lit interrogation room, his hands cuffed to the metal table in front of him. His face was pale, his eyes hollow. The weight of his guilt hung over him like a shroud. He didn't bother trying to defend himself anymore. There was nothing left to say. The story had already unfolded, the truth staring him in the face. He had killed his daughter in a moment of blind rage, and now he would pay the price. Sheriff Wilkins watched him from the other side of the glass, his face grim. He had seen men like Ed before, men who had made terrible choices in moments of weakness. But this felt different. This was a man who had not just destroyed his own life, but had shattered the trust of an entire community. Lily had been loved by everyone in Pine Hollow, and her death had left a wound that would never fully heal. Outside, the townspeople gathered near the courthouse, their faces somber, their voices hushed as they shared the news. The idyllic peace of Pine Hollow had been shattered, the darkness that had always lurked beneath the surface finally coming to light. So there was no going back to the way things had been. In the end, Ed confessed to everything: the fight, the rage, the terrible moment when he struck her down. He told them how he had buried her, how he had tried to cover it up, and how the guilt had consumed him in the days that followed. It didn't take long for the jury to convict him. The sentence was swift life in prison, with no chance of parole. As the prison gates closed behind him, Ed realized that the real punishment wasn't just the bars or the cold walls that would now define his existence. It was the knowledge that he had taken the life of the one person who had once loved him unconditionally, and that his own darkness had destroyed everything he had ever cared about. Back in Pine Hollow, life slowly began to return to its routine, but the scars of what had happened would remain. The townsfolk would never forget the girl with the bright smile, or the father who had let his anger take her away. The whispers in the pines, once silent, now carried the weight of a tragedy that would haunt the town for generations. And in the quiet of his cell, Ed Thompson would live with the knowledge of what he had done, alone with the echoes of his guilt, forever. As the sun rose over Pine Hollow, Ed Thompson sat in the back of the sheriff's cruiser, his wrists cuffed tightly, staring blankly out the window. The forest that once hid his terrible secret was now exposed. Lily's body had been unearthed, with it the truth. There was no more running, no more lies to tell. The town was silent as Ed was driven through its streets for the last time. Faces peered out from windows and doorways, watching the man they once knew being taken away, now a murderer in their eyes. Pine Hollow would never be the same. At the station, Ed signed his confession. The weight of the pen felt like the final nail in his own coffin. He didn't fight it. There was nothing left to fight. The truth was out, and it was heavier than anything he'd ever known. As Ed was led to his cell, he caught a glimpse of the sheriff standing silently in the hall. Their eyes met for a brief moment before Ed was locked away. Alone in the cold, dim room, he realized that this was it, his life reduced to a single act of violence that had taken away the only thing that had mattered. And so, Ed Thompson sat in silence, the weight of his guilt pressing down on him. In the end, he hadn't just buried his daughter, he had buried himself.